The death of a world is rarely sudden. It slips away inch by inch, its brilliance fading so slowly that no one notices the loss. Each generation inherits a dimmer version of life and assumes it has always been this way, unaware of the vibrancy their forebears once knew. The skies grow pale by imperceptible degrees. The harvest shrinks so slowly that farmers blame their own efforts rather than forces beyond mortal control. Rivers run thinner each year, and no one alive remembers when they ran full. This is how worlds end, not with the thunder of cataclysm, but with the whisper of something precious slipping away, unnoticed until nothing remains but hollow shells where abundance once flourished. Long before the rise of empires and the forging of legendary swords, before heroes carved their names into stone and song, there existed a world balanced upon the delicate harmony of four elemental forces: earth beneath, fire within, water surrounding, and wind above. These primal energies did not exist as mere abstractions or philosophical concepts, but manifested physically in the form of four magnificent crystals, each radiating with an inner luminescence that had burned undiminished since the dawn of creation itself. The crystals were more than sources of power. They were the heartbeat of the world, the silent guardians whose light sustained the very fabric of existence, ensuring that seasons turned in their proper order, that crops grew from fertile soil, that the seas remained navigable and the air breathable. For countless generations, civilizations rose and fell beneath their benevolent glow, and though kingdoms warred and empires crumbled, the crystals endured, eternal sentinels watching over a world that had largely forgotten to revere them. But eternity, as it turns out, is a more fragile thing than the ancients believed. The decline began so gradually that no single generation could perceive its onset. Grandmothers would tell their grandchildren of summers that seemed longer in their youth, of winters that bit with sharper clarity, of springs that exploded with colors no longer seen in the muted blooms of the present day. These stories were dismissed as the exaggerations of aging memory, the tendency of the old to romanticize the past, but they contained truths that should have served as warnings. The winds that once carried ships across vast oceans began to still, leaving sails hanging limp against masts for days that stretched into weeks. Captains who had spent their lives reading the currents found themselves becalmed in waters that had once rushed with reliable patterns, their crews growing restless and their cargo spoiling in holds that should have reached port days earlier. Fishermen who had spent their lives reading the currents found the waters growing stagnant, their catches diminishing year after year until entire coastal communities abandoned their ancestral homes, leaving behind villages of empty buildings that slowly surrendered to the elements they could no longer harvest. Farmers in the heartland watched helplessly as once fertile fields began to wither, the soil itself seeming to reject the seeds placed within it, as though the earth had grown weary of producing life. Volcanoes that had slumbered for millennia stirred restlessly, belching smoke and ash into skies already growing dim. And through it all, those who still remembered the old stories began to whisper of the crystals, wondering if perhaps the ancient lights were finally beginning to fade. The crystals were indeed fading. One by one, their radiance dimmed, their power draining away into some unknown void, leaving behind only darkened shells that sat in their shrines like tombstones marking the death of hope itself. The priests who had once tended these sacred objects with devotion and reverence found themselves presiding over funerals that never ended, watching helplessly as the lights that had defined their purpose slowly bled away into nothingness. Some abandoned their posts, unable to bear witness to the prolonged dying. Others stayed until the very end, their faith transforming into something darker as the object of their worship betrayed them through its absence. The wind crystal fell first, its light extinguished 4 centuries before our story begins. With its fading came the destruction of the Lufenians, a civilization of remarkable advancement whose people had learned to harness the wind itself, constructing airships that sailed through clouds and a magnificent fortress that floated among the stars. Their towers had reached toward the heavens in spiraling elegance. Their machines had hummed with energies drawn from the very breath of the world. Their scholars had unlocked secrets of aerodynamics and atmospheric manipulation that modern humanity could not begin to comprehend. They had believed themselves masters of the sky, inheritors of a domain that would be theirs forever. The Fiend of Wind, a terrible dragon called Tiamat, descended upon their sky fortress and claimed it as her own, driving the survivors down from the heavens to huddle in a small settlement on the surface, their language forgotten by the rest of the world, their glory reduced to whispered legends. Those who survived the fall never forgot the sound of Tiamat's wings, the hurricane force of her breath, the way the fortress shuddered as she tore through its defenses. They passed these memories to their children and their children's children, until the trauma became mythology, stories told to explain why a people who had once soared among the clouds now lived in modest buildings that barely reached above the tree line. 200 years later, the water crystal followed, its dimming heralded by violent storms that sank an ancient shrine beneath the waves, trapping the mermaids who had long served as its guardians. The waters had risen without warning on a night when the moon hung swollen and red in a sky choked with unnatural clouds. The mermaids had sung their protective hymns as they always had, their voices rising in harmonies that had safeguarded the shrine for generations beyond counting. But the songs that had once turned aside tsunamis and calmed hurricanes now fell upon deaf waters, their magic draining away with the crystal's light. The shrine descended slowly, majestically, its towers sinking beneath waves that seemed almost gentle in their embrace, carrying the mermaids down into depths where sunlight could not reach and hope could not survive. The Kraken, a monstrous thing of tentacles and endless hunger, made its lair in the drowned temple and fed upon the terror of those imprisoned within its depths. The surviving mermaids could not escape, their magic too weak to carry them to freedom, their existence reduced to hiding in corners of their former sanctuary, while the horror that had claimed their home prowled through chambers that had once rung with song. Some say they could still hear the mermaids weeping on quiet nights when the sea lay still, their laments carrying across the waves to remind sailors of what had been lost beneath the surface. The earth crystal began to fail shortly before the events of our tale, and with its weakening came a rot that spread across the land like a plague made manifest in soil and stone. It started in small ways that could be dismissed as local misfortune. A field here that refused to yield, a well there that went dry without explanation. But the rot spread, creeping outward from an epicenter that no one could identify, transforming living earth into something that resembled ash more than soil. The town of Melmond, once a prosperous community surrounded by verdant fields that had fed the region for generations, watched as the very ground beneath their feet began to decay, crops withering to dust at the moment of harvest, trees collapsing into piles of desiccated wood that crumbled at the slightest touch, the soil itself turning grey and lifeless as though something beneath the surface was drinking away its vitality. Livestock that grazed the fields developed strange maladies, their eyes clouding over, their flesh wasting despite adequate feed. their deaths coming in waves that depleted herds accumulated over generations. Children who played in the affected areas developed coughs that would not clear, fevers that rose and fell without pattern, a general listlessness that suggested the decay was not content to claim only the land. A vampire had taken residence in a nearby cavern, the townsfolk believed, and though they were not entirely wrong, they failed to understand that the bloodless creature was merely a servant of something far more terrible. Lich, the Fiend of Earth, had awakened in the deepest chambers of the Cavern of Earth, and his mere presence was sufficient to drain the life from miles of surrounding countryside, his hunger for vitality extending through stone and soil to claim everything within his reach. Only the fire crystal remained lit, though for how long, none could say. Its shrine sat deep within a volcanic mountain, surrounded by rivers of molten rock that had flowed steadily since before human memory began recording such things. The priests who tended this last bastion of elemental light reported troubling visions, dreams of serpentine shadows coiling through magma chambers, whispers that seemed to emanate from the flames themselves. The Fiend of Fire, a serpentine horror called Marilith with the torso of a woman and the coils of a snake, slumbered in the volcanic depths of Mount Gulg, waiting for the moment when she, too, would rise to claim her crystal. Her awakening would be the final blow, the last light extinguished, and with it would go any hope of reversing the decline that consumed the world. This was the world into which four strangers walked, appearing as if from nowhere on a road leading to the kingdom of Cornelia. The morning mist had not yet lifted when the guards first spotted them. Four figures emerging from the grey obscurity, like dreams taking solid form. They carried no identifying marks of origin, no letters of introduction from foreign courts, no merchant credentials or military insignia that might explain their presence or their purpose. Their clothing was travel-worn but serviceable, the kind of practical garments worn by those who expected to walk long distances and face uncertain conditions. Their faces bore expressions of quiet determination, neither aggressive nor passive, simply focused on whatever destination awaited them beyond the city walls. What they carried instead were four darkened orbs, crystals in miniature that had lost whatever light they once possessed, hung around their necks like the weight of prophecy itself. These orbs caught what little light filtered through the morning clouds and seemed to drink it rather than reflect it, their surfaces possessing a depth that suggested vast spaces compressed into small volumes. The strangers themselves seemed unremarkable at first glance. Young people who might have been farmers or apprentices or children of minor nobility, indistinguishable from countless others who walked the roads of that troubled world. Yet there was something in the way they moved, something in the quiet determination that burned behind their eyes, that suggested they were more than mere travelers seeking shelter for the night. They walked with the synchronized gait of people who had traveled together long enough to anticipate each other's movements, who trusted each other in ways that went beyond casual acquaintance. The guards at the gate of Cornelia observed their approach, with the weary suspicion common to soldiers in troubled times. Bandits had grown bold as the land declined, and strange folk appearing from unknown origins rarely brought good tidings. But when the lead guard caught sight of the darkened orbs the strangers wore, his expression transformed from wariness to something approaching awe. He had heard the prophecies, as had every citizen of Cornelia who bothered to listen to the old stories. The sage Lucan, wisest of the 12 scholars, who gathered at distant Crescent Lake, had foretold that when darkness covered the world and hope itself seemed extinguished, 4 warriors of light would appear bearing darkened crystals. These chosen ones would restore the light to the elemental orbs and drive back the forces that threatened to consume all creation. The guard lowered his weapon and beckoned the strangers forward, leading them through streets that had grown quiet and fearful in recent months, toward the castle where the King of Cornelia awaited. The kingdom of Cornelia was not what it had been. The castle still stood proud upon its hill, its towers reaching toward clouds that seemed perpetually grey, its walls constructed from stone quarried in an age when craftsmen had time for artistry rather than mere function. Banners bearing the royal crest hung from battlements that had never fallen to siege, their colours faded by years of sun and rain, but still displaying the lion and crown that had symbolized the monarchy for generations beyond counting. Yet the vitality that had once animated its halls had drained away with the fading of the crystals. The courtyard that should have bustled with petitioners and merchants and soldiers preparing for training exercises stood nearly empty, its cobblestones growing moss in the gaps where foot traffic had once prevented any growth. The gardens that had been the Queen's pride now showed signs of the neglect that comes when a kingdom faces problems too large for flowers to address. King Cornelia himself appeared aged beyond his years, his hair gone white with worry, his eyes carrying the hollow look of a ruler who watches his realm crumble while remaining powerless to prevent it. Deep lines creased his face, carved not by laughter, but by the endless erosion of hope that comes from watching problems compound without solution. His hands, once steady enough to wield a sword in the tournaments of his youth, now trembled when he reached for his goblet, the physical manifestation of a spirit worn thin by burdens no monarch should have to bear alone. He received the 4 strangers in his throne room, a vast chamber whose tapestries depicted the glories of Cornelia's past in colours that seemed almost mocking given the kingdom's present circumstances. He listened as his chancellor explained the significance of the darkened orbs they carried, the prophecy of Lucan that had been passed down through generations of scholars, the promise that salvation would come in the form of 4 warriors bearing crystals that had lost their light. The prophecy of Lucan was known to him, of course, and he wanted desperately to believe that salvation had finally arrived at his gates. But belief alone was not enough. The king required proof that these 4 were truly the warriors of light and not merely opportunists seeking to exploit desperate times. As fortune would have it, the king had a task that would serve to test the courage and capability of any would-be heroes. His daughter, the Princess Sarah, had been kidnapped mere days before by a knight named Garland, who had once served the crown with distinction. Garland had been the finest warrior in Cornelia's service, a man of considerable skill and unwavering loyalty, or so it had seemed. But something had changed in him, some darkness taking root in his heart that transformed loyalty into ambition and honor into ruthless calculation. He had seized the princess and fled to the Chaos Shrine, a ruined temple to the northwest that had stood abandoned for centuries, and from there he had issued his demands. The kingdom would be surrendered to his rule, or the princess would suffer the consequences of royal defiance. The king's own soldiers had attempted to rescue Sarah, but Garland's blade had proven too swift, his skills too formidable, and those who survived the encounter returned with wounds and warnings. If the 4 strangers could succeed where trained soldiers had failed, the king would know them for the heroes prophecy had promised. The warriors of light accepted the challenge without hesitation. Whether this confidence stemmed from divine certainty of their destiny or simply the foolhardiness of youth, none could say. But they prepared for the journey to the Chaos Shrine with a methodical efficiency that suggested they had faced danger before. The town of Cornelia provided what supplies it could spare, merchants offering weapons and armor at prices that reflected their hope rather than their profit margins, and the proprietors of magic shops teaching spells that would prove invaluable in the battles ahead. The warriors equipped themselves according to their individual talents. Those skilled in physical combat took up swords and wore mail armor, while those whose gifts lay in the manipulation of arcane energies carried staves and memorized incantations of fire and healing. When at last they stood at the edge of town, looking northwest toward where the Chaos Shrine waited, they were as prepared as 4 young strangers with limited resources could possibly be. The road to the Chaos Shrine wound through countryside that showed the early signs of the decay spreading from the south. Grass grew brown at the edges of fields, and the trees bore fewer leaves than the season warranted. Wild creatures attacked with a frequency and ferocity unusual for their kind, as though the disturbance in the natural order had driven them to madness. Goblins lurked in the tall grass, their crude weapons swinging wildly, and the warriors cut them down with a mixture of steel and sorcery that improved with each encounter. By the time the Chaos Shrine came into view, rising from the landscape like a wound in the world, the 4 had begun to understand their own capabilities, to move in coordination, to trust one another's judgment in the chaos of battle. They were becoming, however gradually, a true fighting force. The Chaos Shrine itself was a place of palpable wrongness, a wound in the landscape that the world had tried to heal around rather than through. Once it had been a temple dedicated to forces long forgotten, its architecture suggesting an age that predated Cornelia and perhaps human memory itself. The stones that comprised its walls were not quarried locally, but transported from some distant location by methods no contemporary builder could explain. Their surfaces carved with symbols that seemed to shift in the peripheral vision, never quite holding still when observed directly. The temple had been abandoned for reasons lost to history, its priest departing or dying, its purpose fading from collective memory until it became simply a ruin, a place where travelers sheltered from storms and where children dared each other to spend nights alone. Now it stood in ruins, its walls crumbling, its sacred spaces profaned by centuries of neglect and darker influences that had seeped into the stones like blood into fabric. The approach was littered with the bones of animals that had wandered too close and never returned, their remains picked clean by scavengers that seemed unable to actually inhabit the grounds. Plants grew wrong here, their leaves turning toward shadows rather than light, their flowers blooming in colors that seemed diseased rather than vibrant. The warriors entered through doors that hung broken on their hinges, the wood swollen with moisture that had no apparent source, their first steps into the shrine raising dust that had accumulated undisturbed for years. Creatures lurked in the shadows, things that had crawled from the depths to make their homes amid the rubble, and the warriors dispatched them with growing confidence. In a small chamber, they found supplies left by some previous explorer, a leather cap and a tent and potions that would restore their strength, and they claimed these treasures before pressing deeper into the temple. Garland awaited them in the shrine's central chamber, his form silhouetted against the dim light filtering through cracks in the ceiling. The Princess Sarah sat behind him, her hands bound, her expression a mixture of fear and defiant hope as she observed her would-be rescuers. Garland himself turned slowly to face the intruders, and even through the shadows of his horned helmet, the warriors could sense his contempt. He was an imposing figure, his plate armor bearing the marks of countless battles, his cape flowing behind him in some unfelt breeze, his eyes burning with an unnatural light within the darkness of his visor. The knight spoke with the arrogance of one who had never known defeat. He proclaimed his name and his intention to destroy any who dared challenge him, his voice echoing through the ruined chamber like the pronouncement of a death sentence. He called the warriors fools for daring to face him, promised them nothing but the grave as their reward for interference in his plans. The Princess Sarah was his, he declared, and through her, the kingdom of Cornelia would fall into his grasp. No force in the world could prevent the fulfillment of his ambition. The battle that followed was brief but brutal. Garland was every bit the warrior his reputation suggested, his blade moving with a speed and precision that tested the limits of the four strangers' abilities. But he was one against four, and though he had been the greatest knight in Cornelia's service, he was still merely human. The warriors of light pressed their advantage, their attacks coordinated, their magic supporting their steel, and piece by piece they wore through his defenses. When at last Garland fell, his body crumpling to the stone floor of the chamber that had been his stronghold, the warriors stood over him, uncertain whether to feel triumph or pity. They had won, but the victory felt strangely hollow, as though something about the encounter remained unresolved, a story left incomplete. Princess Sarah's gratitude was boundless. She embraced her rescuers with tears streaming down her face, offering thanks that seemed inadequate to express the depth of her relief. When she had composed herself, she retrieved an object from the folds of her dress, an item she had managed to conceal from Garland throughout her captivity. It was a lute, she explained, an instrument that had been passed down through the royal family for generations beyond counting. Its origins were lost to history, but it was said to possess magical properties that would reveal themselves at the proper time. She pressed the lute into the hands of the nearest warrior, insisting that they take it, that some instinct told her it would prove essential to their quest. The warriors accepted the gift, though they could not imagine what use a musical instrument might serve in the battles that lay ahead. Their return to Cornelia was a triumph. Word of Garland's defeat had somehow preceded them, and the streets were lined with citizens eager to catch a glimpse of the heroes who had rescued their princess. King Cornelia received them in his throne room with tears of joy streaming down his weathered face, embracing his daughter and then turning to address the four strangers who had made her safe return possible. He declared them the true warriors of light, champions whose arrival fulfilled the prophecy of Lucan, and he pledged that Cornelia would support their quest in whatever way it could. His first act of support was to order the reconstruction of the Great Bridge to the north, a structure that had fallen into disrepair generations ago. With the bridge restored, the warriors would be able to continue their journey into the wider world, seeking the crystals that needed to be rekindled, confronting the fiends that had caused the world's decline. The king's chancellor added a sobering note to the celebration. Defeating Garland and rescuing the princess had been a worthy deed, he acknowledged, but the true challenge still lay ahead. The crystals had not dimmed by accident, nor would they rekindle simply because the warriors of light had proven themselves against a single fallen knight. Somewhere in the world, forces of tremendous evil worked to keep the crystals dark, and until those forces were confronted and destroyed, the decline would continue. The earth would keep rotting, the waters would remain stagnant, the winds would refuse to blow, and the fires would burn out of control. The warriors had won a battle, but the war for the world's survival had barely begun. The next morning, the warriors of light crossed the newly reconstructed bridge and left Cornelia behind. They carried with them the gratitude of a kingdom, the lute of Princess Sarah, and the weight of a prophecy that promised they would save the world or die in the attempt. The road ahead wound through unfamiliar territory. toward towns and dungeons and challenges none of them could imagine. But they walked forward nonetheless. 4 strangers bound by destiny, the darkened orbs around their necks glowing ever so faintly with the first stirrings of light restored. Their journey next carried them east along coastal roads that wound between rocky cliffs and churning seas, the spray of salt water misting their faces as they walked paths that had been carved into the landscape by generations of travelers before them. Seabirds wheeled overhead, their cries carrying notes of warning that might have been directed at the strangers, or might have been simply the natural expression of creatures living in an uncertain world. The vegetation changed as they traveled, the cultivated fields around Cornelia, giving way to wilder growth that clung to cliffsides and clustered in sheltered valleys. Eventually, the road descended toward the harbour town of Provoca, a settlement whose existence depended entirely on its access to the sea and the commerce that flowed through maritime trade routes. This settlement, which depended on maritime trade for its livelihood, had fallen under the shadow of a different sort of evil than the one they had faced in the Chaos Shrine. Where Garland had been a singular threat, the danger here was more diffuse, a network of predation that had wrapped itself around the town's economy like a strangling vine. A band of pirates led by a fearsome captain named Bika had seized control of the harbour, their ships blockading the port, their crews patrolling the docks with the swagger of conquerors rather than criminals. They demanded tribute from any who wished to sail or dock, percentages of cargo and coins that left merchants with barely enough profit to justify their voyages. They terrorized the townsfolk with threats of violence if their demands went unmet, burning boats and destroying property when payments arrived late or were deemed insufficient. The warriors found the citizens cowering in their homes, their businesses shuttered, their once prosperous community withering under the weight of extortion. The marketplace that should have bustled with vendors and customers stood nearly empty, only a handful of desperate traders attempting to sell wares that nobody had money to buy. Children who should have been playing in the streets hid indoors, their laughter replaced by the silence of fear. Fishermen who had spent their lives on the water sat idle, their boats rotting at moorings they dared not leave, their nets collecting dust rather than fish. The situation demanded intervention, and intervention was precisely what the Warriors of Light provided. Bika and his crew proved less formidable than their reputation suggested. They were numerous, certainly, and their blades were sharp, but they were disorganized rabble compared to the disciplined coordination the warriors had begun to develop. The battle in Provoca's streets was chaotic and bloody, pirates falling one by one before the combined assault of sword and spell, until at last Bika himself knelt in defeat before the strangers who had ended his reign of terror. Rather than demand the pirate's death, the warriors accepted a different form of surrender. Bika's ship, a sturdy vessel capable of crossing the Aldi Sea, would become theirs, opening routes to distant shores that would have been otherwise unreachable. The pirate and his remaining crew slunk away into obscurity, their threat neutralized, their legacy nothing more than a footnote in the story of greater heroes. The acquisition of the ship transformed the possibilities available to the Warriors of Light. Where before they had been limited to paths that could be walked, their horizons bounded by mountains and rivers and stretches of terrain too treacherous to traverse on foot, they could now sail to any port within the inland sea, reaching communities that had remained isolated from Cornelia and its immediate neighbours. The vessel itself was weathered but sound, its hull constructed from timbers that had been selected for their resilience against salt and storm, its sails patched in places, but still capable of catching wind with efficiency that spoke to the craftsmanship of its original builders. Standing at the helm for the first time, feeling the deck shift beneath their feet as waves pass beneath the hull, the warriors experienced a kind of freedom they had not known possible. Their first destination was the Elven Kingdom to the south, a land called Elfheim that had been established by the fair folk long before human memory began recording history. Legends spoke of the elves as the first children of the world, beings who had walked beneath the stars when humanity still huddled in caves and feared the darkness. They had built their civilization slowly, carefully, with an attention to beauty and harmony that reflected lifespans measured in centuries rather than decades. Where humans, constructed with urgency born of mortality, the elves built for eternity, their cities designed to endure until the end of time itself. These ancient people had kept largely to themselves throughout the centuries, their borders maintained not through force, but through simple disinterest in the affairs of shorter-lived races. But rumors had reached even distant Pravaka of troubles plaguing their realm, troubles that might be connected to the broader crisis afflicting the world. Elfheim proved to be a place of graceful beauty despite its current difficulties. The architecture was all flowing curves and natural integration, buildings that seemed to have grown from the earth rather than being constructed upon it, their walls following the contours of ancient trees that had been coaxed into shapes that served structural purposes while remaining living things. Decorated with vines and flowers that somehow retained their color, even as the world around them faded, the elven capital presented a vision of what civilization could achieve when it worked with nature rather than against it. Bridges of living wood spanned streams that had been redirected to flow through the city center, their waters clear enough to reveal the colored stones that lined their beds. Gardens occupied every available space, each one designed according to principles that made human horticulture seem clumsy by comparison. But the beauty was marred by an atmosphere of profound sorrow. The Prince of the Elves, heir to the throne and hope of his people, had fallen into a magical slumber from which no healer or mage had been able to rouse him. He lay in the royal castle, his breathing slow and peaceful, his eyes closed as though merely resting, but nothing could wake him. Years had passed since he first fell asleep, and with each passing season, hope among his people diminished further. The warriors learned that the prince's condition was no natural affliction, but rather a curse inflicted by Astos, king of the Dark Elves, a creature of malevolence who had long harbored jealousy toward his surface-dwelling kin. Astos had not only cursed the prince, but had also stolen a precious treasure from the witch Matoya, a crystal eye that granted her sight, leaving the powerful but elderly mage blind and helpless in her cave to the north. The connections between these crimes and the resources needed to address them formed a tangled web that would require careful unraveling. To wake the prince, the warriors needed a special tonic that only Matoya could provide. But Matoya would not help anyone until her crystal eye was returned, and the crystal eye was in the possession of Astos, who had retreated to the western keep with his prize. Before confronting Astos, however, the warriors needed to recover another item, a crown that belonged to the king of the western keep. This crown, Astos claimed, had been stolen and hidden in the marsh cave to the south, and its return was required before any audience would be granted. The marsh cave lay in a region where solid ground became a treacherous suggestion, where pools of standing water reflected skies they could not see, where the smell of decay hung so thick in the air that breathing felt like drinking something foul. The cave itself proved to be a place of fetid darkness and constant danger, its passages slick with moisture that seeped from walls of living stone. Fungal growths covered every surface, some glowing with bioluminescence that provided the only light in chambers where torches sputtered and died, others releasing spores that caused the warriors' eyes to water and their lungs to burn. The floor was treacherous, seeming solid one moment, and giving way the next to reveal pools of stagnant water deep enough to swallow the unwary. Creatures thrived in this environment that would have withered in cleaner surroundings, things that had adapted to poison and darkness until they could tolerate nothing else. Poisonous serpents slithered through shadows, their scales the same grey-green as the stones around them, their strikes coming without warning from crevices that seemed too small to contain them. Undead horrors emerged from stagnant pools to attack any who disturbed their rest, their bodies bloated with gases that made their movements unpredictable, their mouths opening to release moans that echoed through the tunnels like the cries of the damned. The warriors fought through floor after floor of the cave, their supplies dwindling, their nerves fraying, their bodies accumulating wounds that their healing magic struggled to address. Every step forward required effort. Every chamber cleared revealed another chamber beyond it, the cave seeming to extend forever into depths that should have exceeded the height of the land above. Until at last they reached the deepest chamber, where the crown sat upon a pedestal guarded by piscademon, fish-like monsters whose claws dripped with paralytic venom that could freeze a person's muscles solid while leaving their mind fully aware of their helplessness. The battle was costly, but the crown was secured, and the warriors emerged from the marsh cave with their prize clutched tightly, gasping clean air like drowning men reaching the surface. Their return to the Western Keep revealed the truth that had been hidden behind layers of deception. The king who had sent them to retrieve the crown was no king at all, but Astos himself in disguise. As the crown touched his brow, the illusion fell away, revealing the dark elf in his true form, a twisted creature of spite and malice whose eyes blazed with triumph. He had manipulated the warriors into recovering the crown, the last piece he needed to cement his power over the elven lands, and now he intended to destroy the fools who had served his purposes. The battle with Astos was the most difficult the warriors had yet faced. The dark elf wielded powerful magic, including spells that could kill instantly if they found their mark, and his laughter echoed through the keep as he pressed his attack. But the warriors of light had grown stronger through their trials, their coordination sharper, their determination unwavering, and in the end, it was Astos who fell, his schemes undone by the very heroes he had tried to use. Among Astos's possessions they found the crystal eye, and with this treasure they made their way north to Matoya's cave. The witch was a peculiar figure, elderly beyond measure, her home filled with brooms that swept of their own accord and cauldrons that bubbled with potions of unknown purpose. She was initially hostile to the intruders who had entered her domain, but when they presented the crystal eye, her demeanor transformed entirely. Sight restored, she examined the warriors with new appreciation and listened to their tale of the slumbering prince. The tonic they needed, she explained, was called the Jolt Tonic, a concoction of her own devising that could pierce any magical sleep. She prepared a dose and handed it to the warriors with instructions to use it wisely. The Jolt Tonic worked precisely as promised. When the warriors returned to Elfheim and administered the potion to the sleeping prince, his eyes fluttered open for the first time in years, his consciousness returning from whatever distant realm Astos's curse had banished it. His gratitude was immense, and he offered the warriors a treasure that had been entrusted to his care by the king of Cornelia in ages past, a mystic key capable of opening doors sealed by ancient magic. This key would prove invaluable in the journeys ahead, granting access to treasures and passages that had remained locked for generations. More importantly, the key would allow the warriors to obtain a substance called nitro powder from a locked room in Cornelia Castle, an explosive compound that would be essential for their continued progress. The dwarves of Mount Gulg had been waiting for someone to bring them nitro powder. Their mountain home sat northwest of Cornelia, a sprawling complex of tunnels and forges where the short but sturdy folk had pursued their craft of metalworking for centuries uncounted. They were a practical people, little concerned with the affairs of the surface world, except where those affairs intersected with their own interests. And their current interest was in destroying a narrow isthmus that blocked sea passage to the western waters. The canal they wished to create would open new trade routes and new opportunities, but the rock was too hard for their tools alone. The nitro powder the warriors brought was precisely what they needed, and they set to work with characteristic dwarvish efficiency. Within hours, a tremendous explosion echoed through the mountains, and when the dust settled, the canal was complete. The warriors' ship could now sail to regions that had previously been unreachable. Their next destination was the decaying town of Melmond, and here the true scope of the serum crisis they faced became unmistakably clear. The earth itself was dying. They knew this before they even reached the town proper, the change in the landscape announcing itself miles before the first buildings came into view. The grass beneath their feet transitioned from green to brown to grey, each step carrying them deeper into territory where life had retreated. Trees that should have been in full leaf stood skeletal against the sky, their branches bare, their bark peeling away to reveal wood that had turned the colour of ash. No birds sang, no insects buzzed. The silence was so complete that the warriors' own breathing seemed intrusive, a violation of the stillness that had claimed this place. Fields that had once produced abundant harvest now lay barren, the soil grey and powdery, incapable of supporting even the hardiest weeds. Furrows that had been ploughed in anticipation of planting remained empty, their edges blurring as the soil lost cohesion and began to drift on winds that carried no seeds. Irrigation channels that should have carried water from nearby streams stood dry, their beds cracked like the skin of something dying of thirst. The farmers who had worked this land for generations had tried everything they could imagine to reverse the decay, hauling water from increasingly distant sources, applying fertilizers that accomplished nothing, praying to gods who seemed to have abandoned this corner of their creation. Nothing worked. The rot continued to spread, and those who remained did so only because they had nowhere else to go. Buildings crumbled as the ground beneath them lost cohesion, walls cracking, foundations shifting, entire structures collapsing without warning into piles of rubble that seemed to decay faster than they should have, stone returning to dust as though time itself had accelerated in this blighted region. The people who remained moved through their dying town like ghosts, their eyes hollow with despair, their faith in the future completely extinguished. They had stopped making repairs because they had stopped believing there was anything worth repairing for. They had stopped planting because they had stopped believing anything would grow. They had stopped hoping because hope itself had become too heavy to carry in a place where everything they tried failed, where everything they built fell, where everything they loved withered away. They spoke of a vampire in the nearby Cavern of Earth, a creature of darkness that had risen from some ancient crypt to plague the land. The warriors accepted this explanation and prepared to descend into the cavern, though something about the situation troubled them. A single vampire, no matter how powerful, seemed insufficient to explain the scale of the devastation they observed. The rot extended too far, affected too much, suggested an influence that went beyond any individual creature's capacity for destruction. But the vampire was a lead, a starting point, and in the absence of better information, it would have to suffice. The Cavern of Earth was a labyrinth of stone passages and treacherous footing, its air thick with the smell of decay, its darkness pressing in despite their torches with an intensity that suggested the shadows themselves were hostile to illumination. The walls wept moisture that left trails of mineral deposits in colors that should not have existed, streaks of black and green, and a sickly yellow that seemed to pulse when observed from certain angles. The floor was uneven, littered with stones that shifted underfoot, creating conditions where every step required attention, and every moment of distraction risked a twisted ankle or worse. Sounds echoed strangely in the tunnels, making it impossible to judge distance or direction, the warriors' own footsteps returning to them from impossible angles, as though the cavern were mocking their presence. Creatures of the underground attacked with desperate ferocity, earth elementals and giant insects and undead things that had crawled from graves disturbed by the shifting ground. The earth elementals were perhaps the most disturbing, beings that should have been servants of nature but had been corrupted into something hostile, their forms composed of the same grey, lifeless soil that covered the land above. They emerged from walls without warning, their bodies reforming from stone and dirt, their attacks carrying the weight of the earth itself. The insects had grown to unnatural sizes, their mandibles capable of shearing through armor, their carapaces resistant to weapons that should have dispatched them easily. And the undead, remnants of those who had died in the cavern over centuries of exploration and collapse, attacked with the mindless hunger of things that remembered life and hated those who still possessed it. The warriors fought their way down through level after level, their progress measured in wounds taken and supplies consumed, until at last they reached the chamber where the vampire made its lair. The creature was ancient, its skin stretched tight over bones that seemed too prominent, its eyes burning with a hunger that had been accumulating for centuries. It had fed well in recent years, the decay above driving animals into the cavern, where they became easy prey, and that strength showed in the power of its attacks. But it fell before their combined assault, dissolving into mist and shadow as vampires are said to do when their physical forms are destroyed, its death cry echoing through the tunnels as it dispersed into nothingness. Yet, when the warriors emerged from the cavern and looked upon Melmond, they saw no improvement whatsoever. The earth continued to rot, the decay continued to spread, and they understood at last that the vampire had been merely a symptom of a far greater disease. Something else lurked in those depths, something the vampire had served, something whose influence extended far beyond what any single creature could accomplish. They had won a battle, but not the war, and the true enemy remained to be confronted. Guidance came from an unexpected source, a sage named Sarda, who dwelt in a cave accessible only through a passage guarded by a titan, possessed knowledge that the warriors desperately needed. The titan demanded payment for passage, a star ruby that the warriors had discovered in the depths of the Cavern of Earth. And once this toll was paid, the way to Sarda's dwelling opened before them. The sage was ancient beyond measure, his eyes carrying the weight of centuries, his voice resonating with authority that came from deep understanding rather than mere volume. He explained that the vampire had been a servant of Lich, the fiend of Earth, an entity of profound evil that had taken up residence in chambers far beneath where the vampire had lurked. It was Lich who drained the crystal's power, Lich whose presence caused the earth to rot and die, and it was Lich who must be destroyed if the world was to survive. Sada provided the warriors with an earth rod, an artifact of his own creation that would open the way to Lich's domain. With this rod in hand, the warriors returned to the Cavern of Earth, descending once more through passages they had thought fully explored, until they reached a stone plate that had blocked their previous progress. The rod shattered the barrier, revealing stairs that descended into depths where no surface dweller had ventured in centuries. The air grew colder as they descended, the darkness more absolute, until at last they emerged into a vast chamber where the earth crystal sat upon its altar, its surface as dark as coal, its light completely extinguished. And before the crystal stood Lich. The Fiend of Earth was a nightmare given form, a skeletal figure wrapped in rotting robes that seemed woven from the shadows themselves, cloth that moved independently of any breeze, that rippled with purposes that had nothing to do with physical forces. His eyes burned with malevolent intelligence in the depths of empty sockets, twin points of sickly green light that suggested awareness far exceeding what bone and magic should have been able to produce. His body was wrong in ways that went beyond simple undeath, the proportions slightly off, the joints bending at angles that defied anatomy, the whole assembly radiating a coldness that had nothing to do with temperature. The air around him seemed to die, dust and debris falling to the ground, as though even the smallest particles could not bear proximity to his presence. He wielded magic of terrible potency, spells of ice and lightning and death itself, his skeletal hands tracing patterns in the air that left after-images burning in the warrior's vision. His voice was the grinding of stone against stone, the settling of graves, the final exhalation of the dying, each word carrying weight that pressed against the spirit as much as the ears. He spoke of the futility of their resistance, of the inevitability of decay, of the foolishness of fighting against endings that came for all things eventually. The earth belonged to him now, he proclaimed, and through the earth he would claim everything that depended upon it, every plant and animal and person who drew sustenance from soil that now served his will. The warriors attacked with everything they had, their blades and their spells and their desperate determination, and the battle that followed would haunt their dreams for years to come. Lich seemed to anticipate their attacks, moving with a fluidity that his skeletal form should not have permitted, deflecting blows that should have struck true, absorbing spells that should have disrupted his essence. His counterattacks were devastating, waves of cold that froze warriors in their tracks, bolts of lightning that left them convulsing on the ground, spells of death that reached directly for their souls and required every ounce of protective magic to deflect. But slowly, painfully, the tide began to turn. The warriors learned his patterns, adapted to his tactics, found moments of vulnerability between his attacks where their own strikes could land. Lich fell reluctantly, his form disintegrating piece by piece until only bones remained, and then even those crumbled to dust that scattered across the floor of the chamber. With the fiend's destruction, the earth crystal began to glow once more, faintly at first, but with increasing strength, its light returning after centuries of darkness. The radiance was warm where Lich's presence had been cold, nurturing where he had been draining, a reminder of what the element was meant to be before corruption claimed it. The warriors felt strength returning to their exhausted bodies, wounds beginning to close, spirits lifting as the oppressive atmosphere of the cavern gave way to something that felt almost like hope. The warriors emerged from the Cavern of Earth to find the world already beginning to change. The grey soil showed hints of colour returning, tiny shoots of green pushing up through earth that had seemed permanently dead. Melman's citizens wept with joy. unable to comprehend what had happened, but understanding instinctively that hope had returned to their land. The first of the 4 crystals had been restored, and with it, the first proof that the prophecy of Lucan spoke true. The Warriors of Light were exactly what they had been named, bearers of illumination in a world that had grown too accustomed to shadow. But 3 crystals remained dark, and 3 fiends yet walked the world. The journey to the fire crystal carried the warriors south across newly navigable waters, through the canal the dwarves had blasted from solid rock, and around the southern coast to a settlement called Crescent Lake. The voyage itself was a revelation, the ship cutting through waters that sparkled with renewed vitality in the wake of the Earth crystal's restoration. Schools of fish appeared where the sea had seemed empty before, their silver scales flashing beneath the surface in patterns that suggested playfulness rather than mere survival. Dolphins accompanied the vessel for miles, their dorsal fins breaking the surface in graceful arcs, their presence a reminder that life welcomed the warrior's mission, even if it could not comprehend its scope. This town, named for the lunar-shaped body of water upon which it sat, was home to the Circle of Sages, 12 scholars who had dedicated their lives to understanding the ancient prophecies and preparing for the day when the Warriors of Light would appear. Their gathering place was a modest building that belied the wisdom contained within, its walls lined with books and scrolls collected over generations, its air thick with the smell of old paper and older knowledge. Maps covered tables, star charts decorated the ceiling, and instruments for observing heavenly phenomena occupied every available surface. Lucan himself dwelt among them, the sage whose vision had foretold the coming of 4 bearers of darkened orbs, and he received the warriors with the reverence due to figures of destiny. He was ancient in the manner of those who have spent so long contemplating the infinite that mortality itself seems to have forgotten to claim them. His eyes, milky with age but still sharp with intelligence, studied the warriors with an intensity that suggested he was seeing more than their physical forms, reading something in their spirits that confirmed what his prophecies had promised. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades spent in contemplation, each word chosen with the precision of someone who understood that language itself was a form of magic, that the right word spoken at the right moment could reshape reality. The sages provided essential information about the path ahead. The Fiend of Fire, Marilith, had made her lair in Mount Gulg, a volcano to the west that could be reached only by navigating a network of rivers that flowed from Crescent Lake. They provided a canoe for this purpose, a small but sturdy vessel that would allow the warriors to traverse waterways too shallow for their ship. They also explained that Marilith had awakened prematurely, roused from a slumber that should have lasted another 2 centuries by the disturbance caused by Lich's destruction. The fiends were connected, it seemed, their fates intertwined in ways that the sages did not fully understand. What they did understand was that Marilith would be waiting, and she would be angry. Mount Gulg was a hellscape of molten rock and searing heat, a place where the boundary between the surface world and whatever burning depths lay beneath had worn so thin that the distinction seemed almost academic. The mountain itself rose from the landscape like a wound in the world, its slopes black with hardened lava flows that had solidified in patterns suggesting frozen agony, as though the rock itself had screamed while cooling. Smoke poured continuously from vents that dotted the mountainside, creating a haze that turned the sun into a dim red disk, barely visible through the perpetual twilight. The smell of sulfur was overwhelming, burning the nostrils and leaving a taste in the mouth that no amount of water could wash away. The warriors' progress through its depths required constant vigilance, careful navigation around pools of lava that bubbled and spat with unpredictable fury. The heat was oppressive, pressing against them like a physical weight, drawing sweat from their bodies faster than they could replenish fluids. Their armor, which had served them well in cooler environments, became a liability here, conducting heat until the metal itself threatened to brand their skin. They learned to watch for warning signs, the subtle shifts in color that preceded eruptions, the sounds of gas-building pressure beneath thin crusts, the vibrations in the floor that suggested instability in the tunnel ahead. One wrong step could send them plunging into molten rock, their bodies consumed before they could even scream. Creatures thrived in the infernal environment, things that had adapted to temperatures that would have instantly killed surface dwellers. Salamanders and fire elementals attacked without warning, their bodies composed of living flame, requiring the warriors to adapt their tactics to enemies that could not be touched without harm. The salamanders were lizard-like creatures whose scales glowed with internal heat, whose breath carried gouts of fire that could ignite clothing and hair, whose very presence raised the ambient temperature to levels that made thinking difficult. The elementals were worse, beings of pure flame that seemed offended by the existence of anything not also composed of fire. Their attacks relentless, and their forms impossible to damage with conventional weapons. The deeper they descended, the more oppressive the heat became, until breathing itself required effort, until every step forward felt like a victory against an environment actively trying to destroy them. At last, they emerged into a vast chamber where rivers of magma surrounded an island of relatively cool stone, the lava flowing in channels that had been carved by millennia of continuous eruption. The ceiling above was lost in smoke and steam, occasional gaps revealing glimpses of stone that glowed red with absorbed heat. The air shimmered with thermal distortion, making distances difficult to judge, making the figure coiled upon the island seem both closer and farther than she actually was. And upon that island, coiled in all her terrible glory, waited Marilith. The Fiend of Fire was unlike anything they had yet faced. Her lower body was that of an enormous serpent, scales the color of blood reflecting the magma's glow, muscles coiling with barely contained power that could have crushed stone as easily as flesh. But her upper body was that of a woman, beautiful in a dangerous and inhuman way, her features sharp and perfect, with an aesthetic that transcended mortal standards of attraction, her expression carrying the cold confidence of a predator who had never encountered prey capable of challenging her dominance. Her 6 arms each wielded a sword of fire that left trails of heat in the air as they moved, weapons that seemed forged from the volcano's heart itself, their edges burning with temperatures that could slice through armor like cloth. She attacked with overwhelming speed, her blades weaving patterns of death that seemed impossible to predict or defend against. The warriors found themselves immediately on the defensive, their own attacks deflected by walls of spinning steel and flame, their attempts to coordinate disrupted by the sheer volume of offensive pressure Marilith brought to bear. Each of her 6 arms operated independently, engaging different targets simultaneously, forcing the warriors to fight what was effectively multiple battles at once. Her serpentine lower body allowed her to move in ways that no humanoid opponent could match, sliding across the stone floor, rising up to strike from above, coiling around to attack from unexpected angles. Fire magic proved useless against her, of course, their flames dissipating into her form as though she were drinking them, rather than being struck by them. But ice spells struck true, each frozen bolt causing her to hiss with pain, her movements becoming slightly less certain, her attacks losing some of their overwhelming precision. Slowly, painfully, they wore through her defenses, finding patterns in her assault that could be exploited, discovering moments of vulnerability between her strikes where their own weapons could find purchase. One arm fell, then another, then a third, her capacity for attack diminishing with each severed limb, her confidence transforming into something that might have been fear if such an emotion were possible for a being of her nature. When Marilith finally fell, her screams echoed through the volcano, like the death cries of the mountain itself, a sound of such intensity that stalactites cracked and fell from distant ceilings, that new fissures opened in walls that had stood solid for millennia. Her body dissolved into embers that swirled upward on thermals created by the surrounding lava, her existence ending not with a corpse, but with a display of light and heat that seemed almost beautiful despite its origin. And the fire crystal blazed back to life with such intensity that the warriors had to shield their eyes from its radiance, its light cutting through the smoke and steam that filled the chamber, reaching into corners that had not known illumination since before her corruption began. 2 crystals restored, 2 remaining. The acquisition of an airship transformed the nature of their quest entirely, lifting them from the surface of a world they had traversed step by step, and granting them dominion over distances that would have required weeks of travel. The Levistone, an artifact of Lufenian origin recovered from the treacherous ice cavern, where it had been hidden by refugees fleeing Tiamat's initial assault, possessed the power to raise a flying vessel that had been buried in the desert for 4 centuries. The cavern itself had been a nightmare of frozen passages and creatures that had adapted to eternal cold, ice wolves and white dragons, and things that had no name in any living language. But the warriors had persevered through determination that refused to acknowledge impossibility. They used the stone as instructed, standing in the sands near Crescent Lake, where the ancient text indicated the airship had been interred. The desert here was empty and still, the dunes unmarked by footprints or any sign of passage, the silence so complete that their own heartbeat seemed intrusive. The Levistone began to glow in the lead warrior's hands, its light pulsing in rhythms that seemed to match the heartbeat of the world itself, growing brighter and warmer until holding it became difficult. Then the ground began to shake. The sand shifted and slid as something massive beneath the surface began to move, dunes collapsing into depressions that marked the shape of whatever lay below. The warriors stepped back, watching in amazement as the ground shook and split, releasing a magnificent craft that rose on currents of wind as though weight meant nothing to it. The airship was a wonder of ancient engineering, its hull constructed from materials that had not oxidized or decayed despite 4 centuries of burial, its lines elegant in ways that contemporary shipbuilding could not approach. Symbols decorated its surface, the written language of the Lufenians preserved in paints that retained their color, their meanings lost but their beauty undeniable. The controls were intuitive despite their alien design, responding to the warrior's touch as though the vessel had been waiting for them specifically, its engines humming with power drawn from sources they did not comprehend. With its acquisition, they could travel anywhere, reach locations that had been inaccessible, explore corners of the world that had remained hidden from all but the most dedicated seekers. Mountains that had blocked their path became features to be observed from above. Oceans that had required days to cross could now be traversed in hours. The entire geography of the world transformed from obstacle to opportunity, and the warriors felt their understanding of their mission expand accordingly. They used this new mobility first to seek out Bahamut, king of dragons, whose domain lay in a chain of islands north of Cornelia, known to sailors as the Cardia Islands. The dragons of Cardia had watched the decline of the world with the patience of their kind, understanding that events would unfold according to patterns older than any mortal civilization. They nested in caves that overlooked seas stretching to every horizon, their scales catching sunlight in displays that sailors sometimes mistook for signal fires or celestial phenomena. These were not the corrupted creatures the warriors had faced in their journeys, not the twisted dragons that served evil masters, but the original forms from which all dragonkind descended, beings of such age and wisdom that the concept of youth had become foreign to their experience. Bahamut himself was ancient beyond reckoning, his scales scarred by battles fought when the world was young, his eyes carrying wisdom accumulated over millennia. He was vast in the way that mountains are vast, his presence dominating not through threat, but through simple existence, the weight of his being pressing upon anyone who stood before him. His breath had shaped landscapes, his voice had ended civilizations, and yet there was no malice in his gaze when he observed the warriors who had sought him out. Only assessment, evaluation, a measuring of worth against standards that predated human existence. He would grant the warriors a blessing of tremendous power, an enhancement to their capabilities that would transform them into something greater than they had been. But first, they must prove their worth. The trial he required was not merely a test of strength, though strength would certainly be tested. It was an examination of character, of determination, of the willingness to continue forward when every rational calculation suggested retreat. The citadel of trials awaited, a fortress of tests and dangers where only the truly courageous could succeed. The citadel was a labyrinth of teleportation plates and shifting passages, its architecture designed to confuse and disorient, its guardians deadly to the unprepared. The warriors navigated its challenges with hard-won skill, fighting through rooms that materialized monsters at every turn, avoiding traps that would have killed them in earlier days, but now seemed manageable given everything they had survived. At the heart of the citadel, they found the proof Bahamut required, a rat's tail that served as symbol of successful completion, its mundane appearance belying its significance. When they returned to the Dragon King and presented this evidence of their worthiness, Bahamut breathed upon them, and the warriors felt power surge through their bodies unlike anything they had experienced before. The transformation was profound and immediate. Those who had been warriors became knights, their understanding of combat deepening, their bodies strengthening, their connection to the martial arts reaching new heights of mastery. Those who had practiced the healing arts became white wizards, their command of curative and protective magic expanding enormously, allowing them to channel divine energies that could turn aside death itself. Those who had wielded offensive magic became black wizards, their destructive potential multiplying tenfold, spells of devastating power now flowing from their fingertips as easily as breath. Those who had blended physical and magical abilities found themselves transformed as well, their hybrid nature refined and enhanced until they stood as bridges between disciplines that had once seemed separate. The warriors of light had become something more than they had been, elevated by the blessing of the King of Dragons into champions capable of facing the challenges that still lay ahead. The water crystal called them next, and the path to its restoration would take them to the depths of the ocean itself, into realms where surface dwellers were never meant to venture. The coastal town of Onrak had long lived in the shadow of strange happenings beneath the waves. Fishermen who ventured too far from shore returned with tales of ruins visible through clear water, of structures that should not have existed in those depths, of faces that watched from below and vanished when observed directly. Most dismiss these stories as the fantasies of men who spent too long at sea, their minds playing tricks in the endless blue expanses. But the older residents remembered truths that younger generations had forgotten. Centuries ago, a magnificent shrine had stood in the bay, a temple dedicated to the water crystal and staffed by mermaids who had sworn to protect its sacred light. The structure had risen from a natural reef, its builders incorporating living coral into designs that blurred the boundary between construction and cultivation. The mermaids had tended the crystal with devotion that transcended the concept of duty, their songs rising through the waters to honor the element that gave them life, their magic maintaining barriers that kept the shrine's sacred spaces dry enough for surface visitors while remaining accessible to their aquatic forms. But when the crystal began to fade, the shrine had sunk beneath the surface, dragged down by forces that the mermaids could not resist. The waters had risen slowly at first, a matter of inches per year that the guardians attributed to natural fluctuation. Then the rise had accelerated, the sea claiming chamber after chamber, the mermaids retreating to ever higher levels until there was nowhere left to go. The Kraken, fiend of water, had claimed the sunken temple as its domain, and the mermaids who had survived the cataclysm were now its prisoners, trapped in an underwater nightmare with no hope of escape. Their songs transformed from hymns of praise into laments of captivity. The warriors learned of an artifact that could allow surface dwellers to breathe beneath the waves, an oxial that produced endless bubbles of pure air. This substance was held by a fairy, a mischievous creature dwelling in a spring near the town of Gaia. But fairies were not simply encountered and asked for favors. This particular fairy required a bottle in which to store the oxiel, and obtaining such a bottle required navigation of yet another chain of tasks and acquisitions. The warriors pursued each lead, with growing impatience, understanding that the water crystal's continued darkness meant suffering for the world, yet also recognizing that no shortcut existed to their goal. When at last the oxiel was secured, they dove into the waters near Onrak and descended into an alien realm of blue shadows and alien pressure. The Sunken Shrine was a place of haunted beauty that would have inspired poets had any survived to witness it. Coral had grown over ancient architecture, softening its lines, creating gardens of living color amid the chambers where mermaids once had sung. Anemones waved in currents that moved through the structure like breath, their tendrils reaching toward the warriors as they passed, curious or hungry depending on interpretations that could not be verified. Schools of fish darted through windows that had once framed views of sky, their scales catching what little light filtered down from the surface far above. The floors were carpeted with sand that had accumulated grain by grain over centuries, and the warrior's passage stirred clouds that took long minutes to settle. But the beauty was marred by darkness, by the presence of monsters that thrived in the deep, by the unmistakable sense that something terrible waited at the heart of the structure. Sharks patrolled the corridors, their movements predatory and patient, their eyes tracking the warriors with the calculation of creatures that had learned to assess prey before committing to attack. Ghosts drifted through walls, the spirits of those who had drowned during the shrine's descent, their forms transparent, but their malice solid enough to threaten the living. And everywhere there were signs of the Kraken's presence, sucker marks on walls where tentacles had pressed, discarded shells of creatures that had been consumed, an odor of decay that somehow persisted even in the water's constant flow. The mermaids they encountered were hollow-eyed with despair, their once brilliant scales dulled by captivity. their voices reduced to whispers that barely carried through the water. They clustered in corners of the shrine that the Kraken rarely visited, their survival depending on remaining unnoticed, their existence reduced to hiding and hoping that each day would not be their last. Their warnings about the Kraken's power were delivered in tones that suggested they expected no help would prove sufficient, their faith in rescue long since extinguished by years of failed hopes. Yet they also spoke of the water crystal and its location, providing guidance that the warriors committed to memory before pressing deeper into the shrine, their determination strengthened by the sight of suffering that demanded response. The Kraken awaited them in the deepest chamber, a mass of tentacles and malevolent intelligence that filled the underwater space with writhing horror. Its body was vast beyond anything the warriors had encountered, a central mass of muscle and hunger from which 8 enormous arms extended in all directions. Each tentacle was thick as a tree trunk and covered with suckers that bore tooth-like projections, capable of gripping and tearing with equal facility. Its eyes, enormous and unblinking, watched the warriors approach with an intelligence that seemed wrong for a creature of such bestial appearance, an awareness that suggested centuries of thought and planning rather than simple predatory instinct. Its attacks came from all directions, tentacles grasping and crushing, while the central body remained safely distant, its beak clicking with anticipation of the feast to come. The warriors fought in an environment hostile to their very existence, their movements slowed by water that resisted every swing of their weapons, their spells struggling against an element that seemed to side with their enemy. The Kraken's ink clouded the water at crucial moments, reducing visibility to nothing just as attacks were about to land. Its tentacles regenerated from wounds that should have been crippling, the severed tips growing back with disturbing speed. And its size meant that even successful strikes landed on sections of its body that seemed disconnected from anything vital, their damage absorbed without apparent effect. But they had grown powerful through their trials, their class changes granting them capabilities that would have seemed impossible in earlier days. Spells of lightning, which traveled through water with amplified effect, struck the creature with devastating force. Blades enchanted against aquatic life found weak points that normal weapons would have missed, and their coordination, honed through battles that would have destroyed lesser parties, allowed them to cover each other's weaknesses and exploit openings that appeared for only moments. Slowly, they dismembered the monster, severing tentacle after tentacle until at last the central body lay exposed and vulnerable, until at last the creature that had terrorized the deep for centuries floated motionless in water that had turned dark with its blood. The Kraken's death was accompanied by a surge of light from the water crystal, its radiance restored after centuries of darkness, illuminating the shrine with brilliance that seemed almost painful after so long in shadow. The light touched every corner of the submerged temple, driving out shadows that had accumulated over generations, revealing details of architecture that had not been visible since the shrine's descent. The mermaids felt the change immediately, their scales beginning to brighten, their voices gaining strength, their songs rising through the water in harmonies that had not been heard since before the crystal's failure. The mermaids wept with joy at their liberation, their songs rising through the water in harmonies that had not been heard since before the crystal's failure. They offered the warriors whatever treasures the shrine contained, including an artifact of tremendous importance, a slab of stone inscribed with the Rosetta Stone, a key to understanding a language that had been lost for 400 years. The language in question was Lufenian, the tongue of the Sky people whose civilization had fallen when the wind crystal dimmed. With this stone, the warriors could communicate with the descendants of that ancient culture, and through that communication, learn the location of the final fiend. 3 crystals restored, 1 remaining. The town of Gaia held more secrets than its unassuming appearance suggested. Among its residents lived Dr. Un, a linguist who had dedicated his life to studying dead and dying languages. The Rosetta Stone was precisely the tool he needed to complete his research into Lufenian, and when the warriors presented it to him, he sequestered himself in his study for days, emerging only to announce triumphant success. He had cracked the code, understood the grammar and vocabulary, internalized the patterns of speech used by a people who had once soared among the clouds. He offered to teach the warriors what he had learned, and though the instruction was necessarily compressed, they emerged from his tutelage able to speak and comprehend the lost tongue of the sky civilization. The Lufenians still existed, though in reduced and melancholic form. Their settlement lay in the western reaches of the world, a small community of buildings constructed in an architectural style that suggested memories of greater achievements. The people themselves were slender and graceful, their features carrying hints of the heritage that had once allowed their ancestors to build floating fortresses and craft vehicles that sailed upon the wind. They remembered what their civilization had been, and that memory made their current diminishment all the more painful to bear. When the warriors approached speaking their ancestral tongue, the Lufenians responded with a mixture of surprise and hope that had lain dormant for 4 centuries. The elders of the Lufenian settlement shared their history and their knowledge. 400 years ago, their people had reached heights of advancement that made contemporary civilization seem primitive by comparison. They had built the flying fortress, a marvel of engineering that hovered among the clouds, serving as both capital and symbol of their mastery over the element of wind. They had constructed airships that could travel anywhere, explore anything, reach destinations that surface-dwelling peoples could only dream about. They had believed themselves invincible, protected by technology and magic that no enemy could overcome. And then Tiamat had come. The Fiend of Wind had descended upon the flying fortress without warning, a dragon of impossible size and terrible power. The Lufenians had fought with everything they possessed, their weapons and their magic and their desperate courage, but nothing could stop the monster's rampage. Tiamat had claimed the fortress as her own, destroying or driving out all who resisted, and from that stolen domain, she had corrupted the wind crystal until its light failed entirely. The survivors had fled to the surface, their airships crashing one by one as the wind itself turned against them, until only a handful reached the ground alive. They had established this settlement and waited, generation after generation, for someone to come who might challenge the fiend and restore what had been lost. The warriors were given a chime that would allow them to enter the Mirage Tower, a structure in the desert that served as gateway to the flying fortress above. This tower had been built by the Lufenians as an emergency access point, a way to reach their aerial domain should other means fail. The chime would unlock its doors and activate the transportation mechanisms within, carrying the warriors up to confront Tiamat in her stolen lair. The Lufenians offered what other assistance they could provide, supplies and encouragement and prayers to whatever powers might still listen, but they knew that the battle ahead would be fought by the 4 strangers alone. The fate of the wind, and perhaps of the entire world, rested upon their shoulders. The Mirage Tower was aptly named, its structure flickering at the edge of perception, appearing and disappearing according to rules that defied normal understanding. From a distance, it seemed solid enough, a spire of stone rising from the desert floor. but as the warriors approached it would shimmer and fade, reappearing moments later in a location slightly different from where it had been. The chime allowed the warriors to fix its presence, to approach and enter and begin their ascent through a structure that seemed designed to confuse and disorient those who lacked proper authorization. Without the chime's resonance cutting through the tower's defenses, they would have wandered the desert forever, chasing a mirage that existed just enough to taunt, but not enough to reach. The interior of the tower was even more disorienting than its exterior. Stairs led upward only to deposit climbers in rooms below where they had started. Corridors twisted back upon themselves without apparent change in direction. Rooms contained doors that opened onto nothing. Emptiness that seemed to extend forever before the doors slammed shut of their own accord. The Lufenians had designed this place as a final refuge, a pathway to their aerial domain that would remain accessible even if all other routes were compromised, and they had protected it with illusions and spatial distortions that would have defeated any army. Each floor presented new challenges, monsters and traps and puzzles that tested their skills and their wits, but they had grown too powerful to be stopped by such obstacles. Blue dragons nested in chambers that seemed too small to contain them, their breath weapons filling corridors with lightning that bounced from wall to wall. Mechanical guardians, relics of Lufenian engineering, activated at their approach, their weapons still functional after centuries of dormancy, their movements precise and deadly. The warriors defeated each obstacle in turn, their progress steady if not swift, their determination undiminished by the tower's attempts to drive them back. At the tower's apex, they found the transportation device the Lufenians had described, a platform of metal and crystal that hummed with energies awaiting release. The mechanism was simple enough to operate, requiring only that they stand upon the platform and will themselves upward. But the sensation of activation was anything but simple. They felt themselves dissolving, their physical forms breaking apart into components that flew upward faster than any body could travel intact. Reality streaming past them as abstract patterns of light and color that hurt to observe. Then reassembly, sudden and jarring, their bodies reconstituting on a platform identical to the one they had left, now surrounded by clouds and thin air, and the impossible architecture of the flying fortress itself. The fortress itself was a tomb of technological marvels, a monument to what had been lost when the wind failed and the Lufenians fell. Machines that had once served their creators stood silent and corroded, their purposes unclear, their potential forever lost to understanding. Consoles that might have controlled the fortress's flight systems displayed nothing but darkness. Workshops that had once produced wonders of engineering contained only rust and debris. The corridors echoed with the warriors' footsteps in ways that suggested the sounds were unfamiliar, that nothing living had walked these halls in centuries, that the fortress had been waiting in silence for so long that any presence felt intrusive. The architecture was beautiful even in decay, the Lufenians having designed their aerial home with aesthetics that prioritized elegance alongside function. Windows that had once offered views of clouds and stars now showed only the pale blue of high-altitude sky, their glass somehow unbroken despite 4 centuries of abandonment. Murals decorated walls, depicting scenes of Lufenian life that seemed almost fantastical. People floating on personal wind currents, vehicles that sailed through storms rather than avoiding them, celebrations held among clouds where participants danced on air itself. The warriors paused before these images, understanding that they depicted a world that no longer existed, a civilization that had achieved heights of advancement that would never be regained. Corridors that had once rung with the footsteps of an advanced civilization now echoed only with the sounds of monsters that had made this place their home in the centuries since Tiamat's arrival. Wind elementals patrolled the halls, beings of living air that attacked with gusts capable of throwing warriors against walls. Wyverns nested in chambers that had once been meeting halls or laboratories, their young crying for food that their parents hunted among the fortress's lower levels. And stranger things lurked in the deeper passages, creatures that might have been Lufenians transformed by centuries of exposure to corrupted wind, their forms twisted into shapes that retained only hints of their original humanity. The warriors navigated the labyrinthine structure with careful determination, mapping passages and avoiding dead ends, fighting through guardians that seemed to grow stronger as they approached the fortress's heart. The air grew thinner as they climbed, the fortress apparently rising higher as they penetrated its defenses, until breathing required conscious effort, and their movements grew sluggish from oxygen deprivation. Yet they pressed on, understanding that the final crystal waited somewhere above, that Tiamat's defeat was the only way to restore the element that had once been the Lufenians' birthright. And at that heart, coiled upon a platform overlooking clouds that stretched to every horizon, they found Tiamat. The Fiend of Wind was the most terrible of the four they had faced, a creature whose existence seemed to warp reality around it. Her form was that of a dragon, but dragons seemed inadequate to describe the sheer scale of her existence. She was vast in ways that challenged perception, her body filling the chamber not through simple size, but through a presence that made everything else seem diminished by comparison. Multiple heads writhed from her massive body, each capable of breathing a different element, each possessed of its own malevolent intelligence that tracked the warriors independently. 5 heads in total, or perhaps 7, the number seeming to shift as shadows moved across her scales. Her wings could stir hurricanes with a single beat. The wind they generated not merely air in motion, but something more directed, more intentional. Currents that sought out targets and struck with purpose. Her claws could rend steel as easily as paper, their edges honed by 4 centuries of nothing but waiting and hating. Her presence commanded the very air to serve her will, the atmosphere in the chamber responding to her moods, thickening when she desired to slow her enemies, thinning when she wished to leave them gasping. She had waited 400 years for this moment, her patience as vast as her power, and she met the warrior's challenge with something that might have been amusement had it not been so terrifying. The battle with Tiamat was the longest and most difficult the warriors had ever fought. Her multiple attacks came in waves, each head striking while the others prepared their own assaults, a relentless barrage that gave no opportunity for rest or recovery. Fire from one mouth, ice from another, lightning from a third, poison from a fourth, and from the largest head a breath of pure disintegration that unmade anything it touched. Her scales proved nearly impervious to physical weapons, their surfaces shedding blows that should have bitten deep, reflecting enchantments that should have penetrated her defenses. Her magic resistance shrugged off spells that would have devastated lesser foes, the energies dissipating harmlessly against hide that had absorbed worse assaults than anything the warriors could muster. The warriors died and were resurrected, their healing magic pushed to its absolute limits, their supplies of restorative items dwindling to nothing. One warrior would fall and another would drag them to relative safety, chanting words of restoration while the remaining fighters held the dragon's attention. The cycle repeated endlessly, attrition wearing both sides down, neither willing to concede despite wounds that should have been fatal. the chamber filled with the smell of blood and ozone and something that might have been fear made manifest. The battle creating conditions that had not existed in this space since Tiamat first claimed it. But they had not come this far to fail at the final hurdle. They had restored 3 crystals and saved 3/4 of the world, and they would not allow the wind crystal to remain dark when its light was within their grasp. They found reserves of strength they had not known they possessed, drew upon determination that went beyond physical capability, fought with a fury that matched Tiamat's own despite their mortal limitations. And slowly, impossibly, the tide began to turn. Tiamat fell at last, her deaths coming one head at a time, each severed neck releasing floods of ancient blood that stained the fortress floor in patterns that would never fully fade. She fought until the end, her remaining heads attacking even as others fell, her body refusing to accept defeat even as damage accumulated beyond any creature's ability to survive. When the final head dropped, when the massive body at last lay still, the wind crystal blazed with restored brilliance, its light so pure that it seemed to wash away 4 centuries of darkness in a single moment. The winds that had lain dormant began to stir, currents of air flowing through the fortress for the first time since Tiamat's original assault, carrying with them the faint sound of Lufenian songs that might have been memory or might have been celebration across impossible distances. 4 crystals restored, 4 fiends destroyed. The warriors stood in the flying fortress surrounded by the light of the final crystal, and they might have been forgiven for believing their quest complete. They had done everything the prophecy demanded, traveled to the far corners of the world, confronted monsters of terrible power, and restored the elemental harmony that sustained all life. The earth would heal, the waters would flow clean, the fires would burn in their proper places, the winds would carry ships and seeds and songs across continents once more. They had saved the world, but the darkened orbs they carried had not yet begun to glow. This detail troubled them as they descended from the flying fortress and returned to the surface world. They had expected the orbs to respond to the restoration of the crystals, to shine with the light of destiny fulfilled, yet they remained as dark as ever, cold weights against their chests that seemed to mock the victories they had achieved. Something remained undone, some task uncompleted, and until that final piece fell into place, the prophecy of Lucan would remain unfulfilled. They sought guidance from the sages of Crescent Lake, from the elves of Elfheim, from anyone who might possess knowledge about what their darkened orbs required. The answer came from an unexpected source. A wise man in the town of Elfheim, the Lufenian settlement, spoke of an ancient truth that had been passed down through generations of his people. The fiends they had defeated were powerful, he acknowledged, but they were not the source of the world's corruption. They were servants, agents of a greater evil that had sent them forth to claim the crystals and drain their light. This mastermind lurked outside the normal flow of time, hidden in a pocket of existence that could not be reached through ordinary means. The fiends had been connected to their master by threads that transcended distance and duration, and though those servants were now destroyed, the master remained, waiting in his temporal sanctuary for an opportunity to begin the cycle anew. The wise man spoke the name that the warriors had heard once before in the ruins of the Chaos Shrine where their journey had begun. Garland, the fallen knight they had defeated in their first real battle, the kidnapper of Princess Sarah, the man who had seemed so insignificant in retrospect compared to the fiends they had later faced. He was not dead, the wise man explained, or rather, death had no meaning for one who existed outside the constraints of time. The fiends had sent Garland 2,000 years into the past at the moment of his defeat, preserving him from the consequences of his failure, and from that distant era he had created them, sending them forward to corrupt the crystals and ensure the conditions that would lead to their own creation. A loop had formed, a closed circle of cause and effect, where the fiends created Garland and Garland created the fiends, where the past and future fed upon each other in an eternal cycle of darkness. The only way to break this loop was to travel back to its origin, to confront Garland in the past before he could complete the circle, to destroy the source of corruption before it could send its agents into the future. The Chaos Shrine held the key, the wise man revealed. Within its depths existed a portal that led to 2,000 years ago, to the moment when Garland prepared to ascend to godhood and seal the loop forever. The lute Princess Sarah had given them would open this portal, its magic resonating with frequencies that could pierce the barriers between eras. Everything they had done, every crystal restored and fiend defeated, had been preparation for this final confrontation. The warriors returned to the Chaos Shrine with new understanding of its significance. They had walked these halls once before, when Garland was merely a rebel knight with delusions of grandeur, when the scope of the threat they faced was limited to a single kingdom's succession crisis. The shrine had seemed abandoned then, a ruin claimed by monsters and neglect, its history forgotten and its purpose lost. Now they understood that the shrine was not merely a ruin, but a nexus, a point where time itself could be manipulated by those who possessed the proper tools. The stones that had seemed merely old now revealed their true age, their surfaces worn by millennia rather than centuries, their placement following patterns that predated human civilization. The lute sang as they approached the altar at the shrine's heart, its strings vibrating in harmonies that seemed to reach beyond the physical world. The sound was beautiful and terrible simultaneously, notes that resonated in frequencies the ear could not quite process, melodies that spoke of distances too vast for mortal comprehension. The warriors felt the music rather than heard it, felt it thrumming in their bones and blood, felt it calling to something within them that had always existed but never before been acknowledged. Before them, the air itself began to shimmer and part, reality separating along seams that had been invisible until the music revealed them. The portal appeared as a wound in reality, a tear in the fabric of existence through which strange lights flickered and impossible geometries could be glimpsed. Looking into it was uncomfortable in ways that went beyond simple visual strain. The shapes within following rules that the mind was not designed to process, their angles suggesting dimensions that should not exist within normal space. Colors that had no names played across surfaces that had no form, creating patterns that seemed almost meaningful, almost comprehensible, yet always remaining just beyond understanding. The warriors hesitated at its threshold, understanding that stepping through meant leaving everything they knew behind, traveling to an era where nothing familiar existed, where even victory might strand them forever in a past that had no place for them. Their friends and families, their homes and histories, everything that defined them as people rather than merely warriors, all of it would remain in the present while they ventured into a past that might not allow their return. But hesitation was a luxury they could not afford. The loop continued to turn, the darkness continued to spread, and every moment of delay gave Garland more time to prepare for their coming. One by one, the warriors stepped through the portal and felt reality dissolve around them. They emerged in the Chaos Shrine of 2,000 years past, and immediately understood that this place was far more dangerous than the ruin they had left behind. The architecture was intact and ominous, its walls decorated with symbols of darkness and chaos that pulsed with inner light. runes that writhed when observed directly, as though uncomfortable under the attention of mortal eyes. The stones that would crumble over millennia stood firm and whole, their surfaces polished to a shine that reflected torchlight with unsettling perfection. The air itself felt different, heavier with potential, thick with energies that had dissipated over the centuries between this moment and the future from which they had traveled. The chambers were populated by creatures that had not walked the world for millennia, things that would become extinct in ages yet to come, but now prowled these halls in the prime of their terrible existence. Their forms were wrong in ways that suggested evolution had not yet settled on shapes that would make sense to later observers, combinations of features that would be separated into distinct species over countless generations. They attacked with ferocity that seemed personal, as though they somehow understood that these intruders came from a future where their kind no longer existed, as though they fought not merely for territory, but against the inevitability of their own extinction. The four fiends were here as well, restored to existence by the temporal mechanics of the loop, waiting in chambers throughout the structure to prevent any intruders from reaching their master. This was the source of their power, the warriors realized, the wellspring from which their corruption flowed. In the future, they were echoes, manifestations sent across time to claim the crystals and ensure the conditions of their own creation. Here in the past, they existed in their fullest forms, their power undiluted by the distance of centuries, their connection to Garland direct and vital rather than stretched across the gulf between eras. The warriors would have to fight through all four of them again, facing Lich and Marilith and Kraken and Tiamat in sequence, before they could confront the entity that had created this nightmare. The prospect was daunting, their bodies still bearing wounds from the battles they had fought in their own time, their supplies depleted by the journey that had brought them to this moment. But there was no alternative path, no way to circumvent the Guardians, no shortcut to the confrontation that awaited. Each battle with the temporal fiends proved more difficult than the original confrontations. The creatures seemed to possess knowledge of the tactics that had defeated them before, adapting their strategies and pressing weaknesses that the warriors had not known they possessed. Lich wielded death magic with even greater proficiency. Marilith's six blades moved in patterns that seemed designed specifically to counter the warriors' fighting styles. Kraken's tentacles grasped with purpose rather than instinct, and Tiamat's multiple heads coordinated their attacks with frightening precision. But the warriors had grown since their first encounters with these enemies, their class changes having granted them capabilities that even the fiends had not anticipated. One by one, the Guardians fell, their essences dissipating into the temporal void, and the path to Garland stood clear. The chamber at the heart of the ancient Chaos Shrine was vast beyond reason, its ceiling lost in darkness that seemed to swallow all light regardless of how many torches were kindled or spells of illumination cast. The floor was a platform suspended over an abyss that might have extended forever, its edges sharp and defined but leading to nothing but emptiness, a void that suggested the shrine had been constructed over a wound in reality itself. Bridges of stone connected to doorways that led nowhere visible, their construction implying purposes that had been forgotten or that had never been meant for human understanding. The air was cold in ways that went beyond temperature, a chill that reached into the spirit rather than merely touching the skin. And upon that platform, surrounded by energies that crackled and writhed with barely contained power, stood the figure the warriors had defeated once before. But this was not the Garland they remembered. The fallen knight had been transformed by 2,000 years of preparation and dark magic into something that was no longer remotely human. His armor had fused with his flesh, becoming a second skin of black metal and malevolent intent that moved as though alive, plates shifting and adjusting without any visible mechanism. His eyes blazed with the combined power of 4 corrupted crystals. 4 points of elemental light turned to darkness, their colors swirling within his gaze in patterns that induced vertigo in anyone who looked too long. His voice echoed from dimensions beyond mortal comprehension, each word arriving from multiple directions simultaneously, creating harmonics that made understanding both easier and more disturbing. He welcomed the warriors with mocking appreciation. They had done well to reach him, he acknowledged, better than he had anticipated when he first set the loop in motion. There was genuine respect in his tone, buried beneath layers of contempt, an admission that their achievements exceeded his expectations, even if they ultimately changed nothing. He had watched them from across the centuries, observed their progress through senses that transcended normal perception, felt each crystal restored as a diminishment of his power that was immediately replenished by the loop's cycling. He explained his plan with the pride of an architect showing off his greatest work. When the warriors had defeated him in the future, the fiends had transported his essence 2,000 years into the past, to this moment where he had waited and prepared and grown in power until he transcended human limitations entirely. The interval had been necessary, time required to accumulate the strength needed for what he intended, centuries spent in meditation and absorption and careful manipulation of forces that most minds could not perceive. He had sent the fiends forward to corrupt the crystals and weaken the world, creating the conditions that would lead to the prophecy of light, knowing that the warriors would eventually come to face him. Their very existence was part of his design, their every action serving purposes they did not comprehend. And now that they had arrived, now that all the pieces were in place, he would absorb their power along with the power of the crystals and become something beyond God or devil. He would become chaos itself. The transformation was terrible to witness, a spectacle of metamorphosis that violated every principle of natural form. Garland's body distorted and expanded, his armor cracking and reforming, his flesh stretching into shapes that the human mind was never meant to process. Bones lengthened and multiplied. Muscles grew in configurations that served no anatomical purpose observers could identify. The sounds were perhaps worse than the sights, the wet tearing of tissue reshaping itself, the grinding of bones against bones that should not have existed, the screams that might have been agony or might have been ecstasy, impossible to distinguish. Wings erupted from his back, vast and membranous, dripping with substances that might have been blood or might have been corruption given liquid form. Their span was enormous, extending beyond the platform's edges to hang over the abyss, their surfaces covered with patterns that seemed to move independently of the wings themselves. His face elongated into something bestial, his mouth filling with fangs that seemed too numerous to count, his eyes multiplying across features that no longer followed any recognizable anatomy. Additional limbs burst from his torso, each ending in claws or weapons or appendages that defied description. When the transformation completed, when chaos stood revealed in all his horrifying glory, the warriors understood at last what they truly faced. This was not merely a powerful enemy, not simply a creature of great strength and dark magic. This was entropy given form, the embodiment of destruction and endings, the final darkness that waited at the conclusion of all things. Chaos was what waited when stories ended, when lives concluded, when civilizations fell and planets died. He was the period at the end of existence's sentence, the silence that followed the universe's last word. And he intended to bring that ending forward, to collapse the distance between now and never, to become the darkness that consumed creation not at some distant future, but immediately, eternally, absolutely. Chaos attacked with the accumulated power of 2,000 years of preparation, and the warriors fought back with everything they had learned across their entire journey. Lightning crackled across the chamber as opposing forces clashed, spells of tremendous power detonating against defenses that bent but refused to break. The platform shuddered with each impact, the stone itself straining to contain energies that exceeded its design parameters. Fire bloomed and ice shattered and winds howled through a space that should have been still, each element responding to the warrior's commands while fighting against chaos's counter-manipulation. The warriors fell and were raised, their healing magic stretched beyond any sustainable limit, their supplies of restorative items exhausted within the first minutes of combat. They had expected this to be difficult. They had not expected it to be impossible. And yet, impossibility was precisely what chaos presented, a challenge that exceeded anything they had prepared for, a threat that grew stronger even as they damaged it. Chaos seemed to feed on the energies released by their conflict, absorbing the power of their attacks and converting it to fuel for his own, laughing at their efforts to bring him down with a sound that was not quite voice and not quite thunder. Each moment of the battle felt like hours, time stretching and compressing, according to rules that Chaos himself seemed to control. The warriors would land what should have been devastating blows, only to find themselves thrown back by counterattacks that arrived before they could recover. They would coordinate perfect combinations only to discover that Chaos had anticipated their tactics and prepared responses that nullified their advantages. He moved through the battle with the confidence of someone who had seen this fight before, who knew every variation and had prepared for every possibility, who considered their resistance not a genuine threat, but merely an entertainment to be prolonged until he tired of the game. But the warriors had something that Chaos, for all his power, could not comprehend. They had each other. They had bonds forged through shared struggle and mutual sacrifice, connections that transcended the individual power each possessed. When one warrior fell, others covered their recovery. When one spell failed, another approach was attempted. They fought not as four separate individuals, but as a single entity with four bodies, their coordination so complete that it bordered on the supernatural. And against that unity, even Chaos's immortal power began to falter. The battle lasted for what might have been hours or might have been eternities, time having little meaning in a space that existed outside its normal flow. The chamber itself seemed to respond to the conflict, walls rippling and floor shifting as reality struggled to contain the forces being unleashed. Chaos fell and rose and fell again, his regeneration slower each time, his attacks growing desperate and unfocused as the warriors proved more resilient than any of his projections had anticipated. The confidence that had marked his initial assault began to crack, replaced first by irritation and then by something that might have been the beginning of fear. The warriors pressed their advantage with the last reserves of their strength, drawing upon willpower that should have been exhausted long ago. They struck at vulnerable points they had identified through painful trial and error, patterns in his defenses that only became visible after countless exchanges. They exploited weaknesses that only sustained combat could reveal, flaws in his form that appeared only when he overextended in attacks that missed their marks. Each blow they landed now carried the weight of everything they had learned, every battle they had survived, every sacrifice they had witnessed along the journey that had brought them to this moment. And finally, impossibly, the moment came when chaos could rise no more. The entity that had terrorized existence across 2,000 years of temporal manipulation lay broken before them, his form diminished, his power draining away into the void over which his platform hung. His multiple eyes dimmed one by one, their light fading like stars being extinguished at the end of the universe. His limbs twitched with residual animation, but could not coordinate into meaningful movement. His voice, which had echoed from dimensions beyond mortal comprehension, reduced to something barely above a whisper. His death was not quiet. The chamber shook as temporal forces unraveled, the loop that had sustained the nightmare collapsing under the weight of its creator's destruction. The stones that had stood firm for 2,000 years began to crack, dust falling from ceilings that had never known deterioration, walls separating along seams that had been invisible until this moment. Chaos screamed with the voices of every soul he had consumed across 2,000 years, his form dissolving into streams of darkness that were drawn toward the portal through which the warriors had entered. The sound was terrible beyond description, a chorus of rage and despair, and something that might have been relief, as though even Chaos himself was grateful for an ending he had never believed possible. The fiends dissolved as well, their existence dependent on a future that was now erasing itself, their power returning to the crystals from which it had been stolen. Lich crumbled to dust in the chamber where they had defeated him. Marilith's flames extinguished, her form collapsing into embers that scattered and vanished. Kraken's tentacles went limp and dissolved into mist. Tiamat's heads fell one after another, her ancient body becoming nothing more than fading shadows. The entire structure of temporal manipulation began to collapse, and the warriors understood that they had only moments to escape before they were erased along with everything else. They ran for the portal, the shrine disintegrating around them, stone falling from ceilings and walls separating into rubble, the floor itself becoming uncertain beneath their feet. The passage back seemed longer than it had been before, the corridor stretching as reality struggled to maintain coherence long enough for them to escape. They ran through visions of a history rewriting itself, of events that had happened differently now that Garland had never survived to send the fiends into the future. They saw the Lufenians continuing to thrive in their floating fortress. They saw the mermaid singing in a shrine that never sank. They saw Melman surrounded by green fields that had never known decay. The visions flickered past too quickly to comprehend fully, glimpses of a timeline being rebuilt from its foundation upward. They burst through the portal into the chaos shrine of their own era and collapsed on stone that now felt blessedly stable, blessedly real, blessedly normal. The air tasted different, cleaner somehow, as though the very atmosphere had been purified by the changes rippling through time. The warriors lay on the floor for long moments, their bodies too exhausted to rise, their minds struggling to process what they had experienced. The battle with chaos seemed distant already, like a dream fading upon waking, its details becoming uncertain even as they tried to hold them in memory. The world they emerged into was not the world they had left. The changes were subtle at first, details that did not quite match their memories. The shrine was still a ruin, but it felt different, cleaner somehow, as though it had been abandoned rather than corrupted. The stones lay in patterns of natural decay rather than deliberate destruction. Vegetation grew in corners where nothing had grown before. Small plants pushing up through cracks in floor tiles, their leaves a vibrant green that suggested health, rather than the sickly growth that had characterized the shrine in their memories. The air outside was sweeter than they remembered, the smell of decay that had clung to even the healthiest regions notably absent. The sky outside was brighter than they remembered, the clouds whiter and less oppressive, the sun shining with a warmth that felt nurturing rather than merely present. Birds sang in trees that stood straighter, their songs carrying melodies that seemed almost celebratory. The very quality of light suggested hope rather than despair, colors appearing more vivid, shadows less threatening, the world presenting itself as a place worth living rather than merely surviving. As they traveled back toward Cornelia, they noticed more and more alterations to the landscape they thought they knew. Fields that had been barren showed crops growing in ordered rows, their stalks heavy with grain that would feed communities through coming winters. Orchards displayed fruit in abundance, branches bending under weights that would have seemed impossible in the world they remembered. Towns that had been dying showed signs of prosperity and growth, new buildings under construction, markets filled with goods and customers, children playing in streets that had known only fear and hunger in the reality they had left behind. People smiled as they passed, greeting the travelers with friendly waves rather than the suspicious wariness that had been common before. Nobody asked about their weapons or wondered at their battle-worn appearance. They were simply strangers passing through, unremarkable visitors in a world that had room for strangers, that did not view unknown faces as potential threats. The transformation was complete and total, affecting not just the physical landscape, but the emotional atmosphere, the general sense of how the world felt to those who lived within it. The crystals, they learned, had never failed. In this timeline, the one their victory had created, the fiends had never appeared to corrupt them. The Lufenians had never been driven from their flying fortress. The Sunken Shrine had never sunk. Lich had never rotted the earth around Melmond. The world had continued along a path of gradual improvement, rather than the slow decline that had defined the reality the warriors remembered. Everything they had fought for, every sacrifice they had made, had created this brighter future where the darkness they had witnessed had simply never occurred. But this meant that no one remembered them. The Princess Sarah, who greeted them at the gates of Cornelia, showed no recognition in her eyes, no memory of having been kidnapped by a fallen knight named Garland. The king who received them in his throne room listened politely to their story, but clearly had no recollection of sending heroes to rescue his daughter, because in this timeline, his daughter had never needed rescue. The bridge to the north had never fallen into disrepair, because there had never been a crisis to weaken the kingdom's infrastructure. The warriors of light had saved the world so completely that the world no longer knew it needed saving. The orbs they carried finally began to glow, faintly at first, then with increasing strength, until 4 points of light shone against their chests, like stars captured in crystal. The prophecy of Lucan had been fulfilled, though the sage himself would never know it, would never exist in a form that remembered making the prediction in the first place. The warriors had done what destiny demanded, and in doing so, they had erased the very need for destiny's intervention. It was a strange sort of victory, a triumph that nobody but the victors would ever acknowledge or remember. The ending was both melancholy and hopeful, a conclusion that satisfied even as it ached. The warriors had given everything to save a world that would never know their names, would never sing songs of their deeds, would never build monuments to commemorate their sacrifices. They were heroes without a history, champions of a timeline that existed only in their own memories, their achievements erased by their very success. The paradox was perfect in its cruelty. They had saved the world so completely that no one would ever know it needed saving. But standing in a Cornelia that had never known fear, looking out at a world that had never known the darkness they had fought against, they understood that anonymity was a small price to pay for the result they had achieved. What did recognition matter compared to the laughter of children who would grow up without the shadow of apocalypse hanging over their futures? What value had fame when measured against the lives that would flourish because the crystals had never failed? They had sought to save the world, not to be celebrated for saving it, and the distinction was everything. The wind blew clean across the land, carrying the scent of flowers from fields that had never known rot. It rustled through leaves of trees that had never withered, played with the hair of people who had never feared the sky, stirred banners of kingdoms that had never faced extinction. The waters sparkled under sunlight that had never been dimmed by corrupted crystals, their surfaces reflecting clouds that moved with purpose, rather than stagnating in skies that had forgotten how to breathe. Fish swam in abundance through rivers that had never run foul, their scales catching light in displays that fishermen would have found commonplace, but that the warriors recognized as miracles. The earth supported life with the vigor of a world that had never been drained of its vitality, its soil dark and rich with nutrients that fed crops growing in abundance, its depths stable and secure rather than riddled with the decay that Lich had spread. Mountains stood firm without the tremors that had plagued them, their peaks capped with snow that would melt in spring to feed the rivers below. Fire burned in hearths and forges, serving the needs of a civilization that had never worried about the flames going out of control, never feared the eruptions that had threatened when Marilith stirred in her volcanic lair. The four elements existed in harmony, balanced as they had been since the dawn of creation, unaware of how close they had come to eternal imbalance. The crystals shone in shrines that had never known darkness, tended by priests who had never experienced the terror of watching their sacred charges fail. The elemental forces flowed through the world in patterns that followed natural laws, sustaining life and supporting growth, and creating the conditions that allowed civilizations to flourish. It was, in every measurable way, a better world than the one the warriors remembered, a world where the suffering they had witnessed had simply never occurred. The warriors walked away from Cornelia's gates as the sun began to set, four figures disappearing down a road that led to futures unknown. Their silhouettes grew smaller with distance, their forms eventually swallowed by the gathering twilight, their passage marked only by the dust their feet stirred from a road that would remember their weight for perhaps a day before wind and traffic erased all trace. Perhaps they found lives of peace and contentment in the world they had created, settling in some quiet village where they could grow old, watching the prosperity they had made possible. Perhaps they continued to seek adventure, their taste for battle and travel having become too ingrained to abandon, their skills still sharp and their hearts still yearning for the intensity of purpose they had known during their quest. Perhaps they simply faded into the population, becoming farmers or merchants or scholars, their extraordinary origins known only to themselves. They might have married, raised children, told stories that their descendants dismissed as exaggeration or invention. They might have spent quiet evenings watching sunsets and remembering a different world, one where such beauty was rare and precious rather than commonplace. They might have carried their secret to their graves, taking with them the only memories of a nightmare that had been erased before it could truly begin. The story does not follow them beyond this point, does not reveal what became of the four strangers who appeared one day with darkened orbs and left having saved creation itself. Their personal fates are their own. private conclusions to a public triumph that no one would ever acknowledge. What remains is the world they left behind, a world of possibility and hope, of crystals shining eternal and elements flowing in their proper courses. What remains is the world they left behind, a world of possibility and hope, of crystals shining eternal and elements flowing in their proper courses. The people of this timeline lived their lives without knowing how close they had come to losing everything, without understanding that their happiness was purchased by the courage of 4 anonymous travelers who asked for nothing in return. They went about their daily business, their concerns the ordinary concerns of ordinary people, their joys the simple joys of harvest and holiday and homecoming. They complained about taxes and weather and the neighbor's dog. They celebrated weddings and births and promotions at work. They lived, in short, the full, rich, messy lives that people are meant to live, unaware that such living had once been threatened by forces beyond their imagination. Children grew up in a world where the stories of fiends and failing crystals were merely old legends, cautionary tales with no apparent connection to reality, bedtime stories told to teach lessons about courage and persistence rather than warnings about genuine dangers. They played at being heroes, wooden swords clashing in backyards, their adventures ending when mothers called them home for dinner. They had no way of knowing that real heroes had once walked their roads, that the peaceful world they took for granted had been purchased with sacrifice they could not comprehend. Generations passed, and the gap between myth and history widened, until even the most dedicated scholars dismissed the prophecy of Lucan as metaphor rather than genuine prediction. Academic papers were written analyzing the cultural significance of the warriors of light mythology, treating the stories as expressions of collective hope rather than accounts of actual events. Theologians debated whether the crystals had ever possessed literal power, or had always been symbols of abstract concepts like harmony and balance. The truth receded into legend, and legend faded into folklore, and folklore became merely stories that grandparents told because their grandparents had told them. But somewhere, perhaps in the quiet places where memory and reality overlap, the truth persisted, in dreams that visitors could not quite remember upon waking, in moments of déjà vu that suggested experiences that had never occurred in this timeline but had happened nonetheless, in the way certain places felt charged with significance that had no apparent source, shrines and ruins that seemed to whisper of events that history had forgotten. The fabric of reality retained impressions of what had been overwritten, traces of a timeline that no longer existed, but whose echoes refused to entirely fade. The warriors of light had existed. They had faced darkness and emerged victorious. They had broken a loop that would have consumed all of creation, destroyed an evil that had planned its triumph for 2,000 years, restored a world that would never know it needed restoration. Their names might be forgotten. Their faces might fade from all recollection. Their very existence might become nothing more than the subject of debate among scholars who did not believe in them. But the consequence of their actions would endure as long as the crystals continued to shine, as long as the elements continued to flow, as long as life continued to flourish in a world they had saved. And so the story of the first Final Fantasy reaches its conclusion, not with trumpets and celebrations, but with the quiet satisfaction of a task completed, a destiny fulfilled, a world set right. The 4 strangers who began the tale as uncertain wanderers became legends that would never be told, heroes whose greatest achievement was ensuring that their heroism would never be necessary. It is a bittersweet ending, perhaps, one that acknowledges the cost of true sacrifice, the loneliness of being the only ones who remember what was lost and what was gained, but it is also a hopeful ending, suggesting that courage and sacrifice can make a difference even when no one is watching, even when no one will ever know. The crystals shine in their shrines, their light undiminished by centuries that in another timeline would have seen them fail. Priests tend them with devotion that has never been tested by doubt. Pilgrims visit them seeking blessings that have never seemed scarce. The world continues to turn, seasons following seasons, generations following generations, the great wheel of existence spinning onward as it was always meant to spin. And somewhere beyond the boundaries of time and memory, 4 warriors of light still walk the roads they helped to build, forever young, forever brave, forever luminous in the darkness they conquered so completely that the darkness itself forgot it had ever existed. This tale from 1987 laid the groundwork for one of the most enduring franchises in gaming history, a foundation upon which dozens of sequels and spin-offs would eventually be built. Created by Hironobu Sakaguchi during a period when his career hung in the balance, the game represented not merely a professional gamble, but a personal statement about what interactive storytelling could achieve. Sakaguchi had watched Square's fortunes decline through a series of commercial disappointments, and this project was intended as a final attempt at success before moving on to other pursuits, perhaps leaving the gaming industry entirely. The name itself reflected this uncertainty, a title that could be interpreted as either a reference to the fantasy genre or a commentary on the circumstances of its creation. Final Fantasy, because it might be the final fantasy Sakaguchi ever created. Final Fantasy, because it represented the last chance for a company teetering on the edge of irrelevance. The irony of that name has only grown sharper with time, as what was intended to be an ending became instead a beginning, launching a franchise that would span decades and generations, inspiring countless sequels, adaptations, and reimaginings that continue to this day. What emerged instead of an ending was the start of something that would define console role-playing games for an entire era. The combination of science fiction and fantasy elements, which would become a hallmark of the series, first appeared here in the form of airships, an ancient technology, alongside swords and sorcery. The emphasis on narrative depth, on creating stories with emotional resonance rather than merely providing excuses for combat, established expectations that later entries would elaborate upon. The willingness to tackle serious themes including death, sacrifice, and the nature of heroism set Final Fantasy apart from many of its contemporaries, suggesting that games could aspire to the same emotional complexity as other storytelling media. The story of the Warriors of Light, simple as it may seem compared to later entries in the series, established themes that would recur throughout the franchise's extensive history. The corruption of elemental forces, the conflict between technological progress and natural harmony, the journey from obscurity to heroism, the sacrifice of self for the greater good. These ideas would be refined and expanded in subsequent installments, their expressions growing more sophisticated as technology allowed for more detailed presentation. But their seeds were planted here, in the tale of 4 strangers who arrived in Cornelia with nothing but darkened orbs and a destiny they did not yet understand. The time loop narrative, revolutionary for its era, introduced a complexity to the plot that elevated Final Fantasy above many of its contemporaries in the console RPG space. The revelation that Garland and Chaos were the same entity, that the Fiends had created the conditions for their own existence, that victory required not just defeating evil, but preventing it from ever arising. These twists gave players something to think about beyond mere combat and exploration. Most games of the era offered straightforward conflicts between good and evil, heroes defeating villains through application of sufficient force, Final Fantasy demanded that players understand the mechanisms of the threat they faced, that they trace cause and effect through temporal loops that violated intuitive understanding of how time should function. The ending, with its implications of a rewritten timeline where the heroes would never be remembered, added a layer of melancholy that distinguished the game from simpler tales of good triumphing over evil. There was no parade, no crowning ceremony, no acknowledgement of the warriors' achievements. They won by erasing the need for their victory, saved the world by ensuring it never needed saving in the first place. The sacrifice was complete and irreversible, not a dramatic death scene, but something quieter and in some ways more profound. The surrender of recognition and remembrance in exchange for the world's continued existence. The four fiends themselves became iconic figures in the franchise, their elemental associations and distinctive designs inspiring countless variations in later games. Lich, the skeletal master of earth and death, established a template for undead villains that would be referenced and reimagined throughout the series' history. Marilith, the serpentine warrior of flame with her 6 sword-wielding arms, created an image so striking that she would return in various forms across multiple titles. Kraken, the tentacled horror of the deep, embodied the terror of the ocean's unknown depths in ways that resonated with players who had never seen the sea. Tiamat, the multi-headed dragon of the skies, drew from mythological sources while establishing a distinctly Final Fantasy interpretation of draconic evil. These creatures represented more than just bosses to be defeated, more than obstacles placed to test players' skill and character progression. They embodied the corruption of natural forces, the perversion of elements that should sustain life into agents of destruction. Earth should support and nourish, but Lich made it rot and wither. Fire should warm and energize, but Marilith made it consume and destroy. Water should cleanse and sustain, but Kraken made it drown and imprison. Wind should carry and refresh, but Tiamat made it tear and devastate. Their defeat was not merely a mechanical victory, not simply a matter of reducing hit points to 0, but a restoration of cosmic order, a return of the elements to their proper functions. The world itself, though limited by the technology of its era, suggested depths that invited exploration and imagination. The decline of the Lufenians hinted at histories that extended far beyond what the game could explicitly depict, a civilization of tremendous advancement reduced to a handful of survivors speaking a language no one else remembered. The mermaids of the Sunken Shrine implied cultures and societies that had developed independently of human contact, underwater realms with their own concerns and conflicts and traditions. The dwarves and elves and dragons that populated the landscape created a sense of a world with its own logic and history, a place that existed beyond the boundaries of the player's direct experience. Each location carried its own atmosphere, its own story suggested through visual design, and the snippets of dialogue available from its inhabitants. Cornelia was a kingdom in decline, its glory fading with the crystals it had once taken for granted. Pravaka was a community under siege, its maritime heritage held hostage by criminals who exploited its dependence on the sea. Elfheim was ancient sorrow made manifest, a civilization old beyond human understanding, now diminished by a curse it could not lift. Melmond was despair incarnate, a town watching itself die one field at a time. The Lufenian settlement was nostalgia and loss, a people who remembered flying now bound to the earth forever. Every place the warriors visited told its own story, contributed its own thread to the larger narrative being woven. What began as a desperate gamble became a foundation for countless adventures to follow. The crystals would return in various forms, sometimes as literal objects, and sometimes as metaphors for the forces that sustain existence. The Warriors of Light would be reimagined generation after generation, their specific identities changing, but their essential nature remaining constant. The battle against cosmic darkness, the journey from obscurity to heroism, the sacrifice required to protect what matters. These elements would be refined and expanded, given new contexts and new expressions, but they would never be abandoned. The original remains remarkable, not despite its simplicity, but because of it. Stripped of the elaborate cinematics and voice acting and photorealistic graphics that would characterize later entries, the first Final Fantasy told its story through limited text boxes and player imagination, inviting those who played to fill in the gaps with their own interpretations. The Warriors of Light were blank slates, their personalities and relationships defined by whoever held the controller, rather than by scripted dialogue. This openness created a different kind of engagement, a participatory storytelling that allowed players to feel ownership over a narrative that might otherwise have felt predetermined. If this journey through the complete story of the first Final Fantasy has illuminated corners of a tale that time has partially obscured, if it has conveyed some sense of why this particular game matters in the broader context of gaming history, then it has served its purpose. The story deserves to be remembered, not just as a historical curiosity, but as a genuine achievement in its own right, a tale of heroism and sacrifice that resonates across the decades since its original release. The Warriors of Light saved a world and ensured that world would never know it needed saving. Perhaps we can remember them, even if the citizens of that restored reality never will. The crystals shine, the world endures, and somewhere beyond the boundaries of time and memory, 4 strangers still walk toward a destiny that was always theirs to fulfill. If you found value in this exploration of gaming's past, consider letting me know by leaving a like or sharing your own memories of this classic tale in the comments below. Your engagement helps bring more of these forgotten stories back into the light where they belong. And if you have not already, subscribing ensures you will not miss future journeys into the lore and legends that shape the games we love. Until next time, may your own adventures be worthy of the heroes who came before.